We need to really see the lack of childcare and early education as a public health emergency, right? Many children won't get the services and programs that they need to support their health and well being.
Stacey, as the top Democrat in the Georgia Assembly, you at the time worked on bipartisan efforts to save universal pre-K from some budget cuts. So could you talk about how politicians see this topic? Is it a local issue? Is it a national issue? Is it a back burner issue?
I think we have to remember that for most politicians, they deal with the people who can vote them out of office, and that tends not to be 0 to 3. And so, unfortunately, while it is a constant conversation, it rarely gets the prioritization it requires. But it's also the most short-sighted set of decisions we can make if we do not give it primacy. If we educate children 0 to 3, prepare them for pre-K and prepare them for kindergarten, we are actually preparing our societies for stronger education, for lower rates of incarceration, for higher rates of productivity, and for sustainable opportunity for those families. What we see happen, though, is that it gets encompassed in this larger conversation of education, and then it gets shunted to the side because the presumption is parents should be in charge of early childhood education, ignoring that cycles of poverty, cycles of lack, cycles of undereducation have prevented the capacity of those parents to provide for their children what they need. But we also know that it's a significant part of our economic system, that we are watching families that have to go back to work, unfortunately, are being forced back to work too early. But when they go back, when they're essential workers, they have to have somewhere for those children to not only be taken care of, but to learn. And the one thing I'm going to point out is that we know that if we do not tackle this issue, 4.5 million children will live in childcare deserts by the end of this pandemic. And because of those razor thin margins, because of that low pay, because of the lack of attention being paid in the CARES package and the upcoming relief packages, unless we have specific investment in childcare and early learning, we are going to watch another generation of children fall behind.
We know the pandemic has closed childcare centers, and that's a pause that a lot of operators might not be able to survive. And Stacey, you talked about the CARES Act. Let's just unpack that a little bit. What needs to be done on the state policy level, the national policy level, to ensure that we have adequate early childhood education, adequate, daycare post-COVID? Stacey, you want to take that?
Sure. And I think we have to start with the current pandemic and move into recovery.
Yes.
Because one of the challenges we have is we tend to skip over the immediacy of need, and that then allows us to ignore the long-term responsibility. And so if we start with the investment that needs to be made right now, the National Women's Center estimates that there should be about $50 billion put in place for the childcare space. That means in-home workers. Those are the folks who, we used to go to Miss Carter's house. That was our childcare. And she made sure that we read, that we learned. We need to make certain that those thin margins that those childcare providers are operating with are not going to lead to their decimation. And unfortunately, we know that those slots are going to disappear if they are not invested in during this process. A lot of those families, a lot of those providers aren't currently eligible for the Paycheck Protection Act. And so they're not getting the resources they need. We need to also make certain that those workers have access to health insurance. Those teachers, those pre-K teachers, those K through 12 teachers get the most attention, but we need to pay attention to the underpaid educators who are usually childcare workers and are pre-K teachers, that they have health insurance and they get subsidized payments. And to the point that you made, Chastity, we know a number of them are also on public benefits. They are taking advantage of our social safety net. Their income should not count against their safety net benefits. The second part is that we have to have federal responsibility, but local implementation. And that's, I think, the other challenge. There's this notion that if we cede it to the federal government, they will fix it for everyone, which isn't true. But they can set standards and they can provide the resources. But on the state and local levels, we need to make certain that we're meeting people at the point of their needs. We know that in rural communities, we already have childcare deserts, where Head Start is the single most effective program, but it's also the single largest provider of any childcare oversight for 0 to 5. So we need to make certain that those investments are made and that those frontline workers who traditionally are still at work, that they are given the protective, the personal protective equipment that they need, and that they are being given the supports they need. Long term, we need to plus up salaries. There should not be low wage workers taking care of our most precious people. They should not be having to struggle to reach their own basic necessities while they take care of our children, while they educate the next generation. And so they should be plussed up in terms of making sure that their wages are not just minimum wage, but living wage. They need to have access to health insurance, and they need access to housing, because often what creates childcare deserts is that those who can provide those services can't afford to live in the communities where the services are needed.
We need to really see the lack of childcare and early education as a public health emergency, right? Many children won't get the services and programs that they need to support their health and well-being. And we know this is likely to impact the poor and marginalized communities. We need to really provide adequate funding, support, and really pay our workforce, our essential workforce, as they have been deemed across the country during this pandemic, especially when we understand the importance of the first 3 years of life with brain development and so much more.
What do we do? What do we do beyond increasing awareness? What actions can parents and educators, community activists take to advocate for this kind of increase in funding so that we can have better quality early childhood education? Stacey, what can regular folk do?
Number one, they can complete the census. And I know that seems like a small thing, but the hardest to count communities are people of color, immigrants, rural communities, and children between the ages of 0 and 5. The reason this matters is that we use those numbers to predict investment in Head Start, in SNAP benefits, in our entire infrastructure. It's predicted based on the numbers today. And so we extrapolate as a nation from what we have today to what we need in 10 years. What that means is that if children are undercounted, the resources they need will never show up, but that also hamstrings the children to come. Go to my2020census.gov, fill out your census, do it immediately. Because that number not only controls the economic investment, and I'm going to put one quick fine point on it, for communities of color, the expected undercount, so the number of people they don't think they're going to get to, will cost our communities $8.2 billion every year. That underinvestment compounds. So every year you don't get what you need is a year where you fall further and further behind, and this lasts for a decade. And we've got to understand this is what happened to us 10 years ago, which is why we're in the position we're in now. So fill out the census. That's number one, because it also allocates political power. This is an election year. And the best time to advocate for what we need is when people need our votes. The work that I'm doing, not only with Fair Count, which is my organization working on the census, but Fair Fight, which is working on voting rights, is about the fact that we have the ability to transform the policies that will guide us through recovery. That only happens if we show up at the polls. And what's going to happen is in this election cycle, we're going to see a lot of different types of campaigning, but those who need to advocate, those parents who are facing losing their jobs because they can't afford to go to work and take care of their kids, they need to be asking the question of every person who wants their vote, what are you going to do to help me? You want to demand that there be subsidies, that the low pay that childcare workers receive be increased, but also that it becomes a national policy that childcare is an essential provision of services. Because when the economy reopens, when people go back to work, if we do not have the ability to protect our children, families are going to be forced to make terrible choices. So make sure you're registered to vote and make sure you hold your elected leaders accountable. And if they're not responsive, fire them. That's what an election is. It's about hiring and firing the leaders of our cities, our counties, our states, and our federal government. We have that power in 2020 in ways we will not see for another 4 years. And so use that power now, because they're a captive audience and you deserve to be heard. I like to think of it in 3 things. One is speaking up. So often we struggle in silence. We don't tell our story because we're ashamed that we couldn't solve the problem ourselves. And because we struggle in silence, we don't realize that the person next door has the same exact problem. So our first responsibility is to speak up. share your story, not only with the elected officials, but with your neighbors so that you, and with your colleagues, so that they understand that this doesn't just impact them or you, but it's a societal challenge. The second is show up. And in days when we actually got to go outside, I would say go to your Capitol, but in lieu thereof, call, text, email. Actually, not only share your story with the people around you, but show up in the spaces where your elected officials are and make them understand your story. And the third thing is that we have to hold them accountable. So you speak up, you show up, and then you stand up. And that stand up is by saying, if I do not hear from you, your plan for solving this problem, then I'm going to use that as the reason I vote. And I'm going to tell all those people with whom I shared my story that they should use it as well. That's how you get legislators at every level of government, how you get executives to respond. It's by speaking up, showing up, and then standing up.
You can find more at onedetroitpbs.org or subscribe to our social media channels and sign up for our One Detroit newsletter.